welcome to the Esports Performance Summit. Our guest today is Abilio Rodriguez. Abilio, welcome to the summit.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey, as we get started, do you mind giving us some background on yourself and kind of how you got into esports and what you're currently doing in relation to esports?
Yeah, definitely. My background is I'm a lifelong gamer. I've loved gaming my whole life. That being said, I've never been good at gaming, so I try to find a way to, blend what I know with what I love. So currently, I work as a physical therapist with the University of Miami. I specialize in orthopedics. Graduated in 2017, still working there. And then I run a blog over at nerdsandwellness.com where we focus on esports, cosplay, and just general health and wellness information. And that's where I basically put a lot of my esports information on. And I guess kind of what got me whole started in esports was last year I did a residency program in orthopedics for physical therapy. And we had to do a case study during that residency. And then part of that case study was, picking a topic you wanted and seeing it through over the course of the year. So I looked at the effects of aerobic exercise on esport performance, and we'll kind of get into that in the presentation later on.
No, I'm looking forward to that, and I want to hear. I'm curious, like what even what made you want to do that? Like, what tipped you off that esports even needed physical therapy and training? Like, how did you even come across that? Was it through your personal gaming, or how did that come up for you?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, looking at esports traditionally from an athletic view, and looking at esport athletes as athletes because that's essentially what they are. There's a lot of literature out there on performance enhancement for the other four major professional North American sports, whether it be baseball, football, basketball, or hockey. And there's a lot of research out there, and we know how to get a baseball pitcher 5 miles per hour on their fastball, but we don't know how to make an esports player better at Rocket League or Overwatch or Fortnite. So I guess just being a gamer and seeing that there was a deficit in that market is kind of what drove me to look at this. And then also looking at it from, so my background and my expertise is in physical therapy and rehab, but unfortunately there's not really a market right now for rehab for esports athletes because unfortunately a lot of these players are highly replaceable. So I started to
Hmm.
kind of change my view and look at it more from a performance enhancement and preventative health standpoint because I feel that's more where the market is right now, and that's more where the trends are for esports. So I thought it'd be better to dedicate my efforts that way.
No, that's helpful because one of the things I've learned throughout the summit and other engagements with esports is, there's a lot of focus on preventative care, which I'm a huge fan of because obviously you'd rather prevent the care than have to have any kind of bigger problems down the road. But also, there's the idea when it comes to esports, there's preventative care in terms of just not getting injured, but also, and you call that maybe defensive, then maybe an offensive perspective in terms of not just preventing things, but actually improving your performance and getting better.
That,
And it sounds like that's something that you're focusing on here.
that's exactly what I'm focusing on.
Perfect. Well, we've got a special treat today because you actually have a slideshow, and so I'm really excited for you just to kick that
Yeah.
off and get going, and so we can dive in there.
All right, let's get looking at it. So this is a condensed version of a PowerPoint I actually present at when I go talk to pro teams or college teams or other video game clubs, but it has a lot of the main points that I think are important. So we're going to talk about aerobic exercise, we're going to talk about breathing and inspiratory muscle training, and then we'll talk about motor imagery. All right, whoops. All right, here we go. So the traditional athlete, looking at performance enhancement for any sport, and not just esports, for any sport, we have to start with operational definition. So we have to start somewhere where you can deconstruct a concept and then track that concept over time and make sure you're actually seeing improvements in that concept versus just saying like this baseball pitcher is a better pitcher now because he went through my training program. No, he's a better pitcher because he's throwing strikes 25% more of the time and he's throwing 5% or 5 miles per hour more on his fastball. Same thing with an esports athlete. When you look at athletes in general, we're looking at six main domains, and those are coordination, endurance, agility, power, strength, and speed. So the trick with esport athletes is it's really hard, especially from a scientific perspective, to deconstruct a game, deconstruct an athletic event, and try to trace improvements because between games the map might be different, between games your opponent's skill level might be different. So there's a lot of variability in esports, but essentially if you break it down, an esport athlete is focused on endurance, coordination, and speed. Endurance because esport matches can last 5 to 10 minutes. They can last up to an hour. And a lot of times, if you're doing well in a competition, you're probably going to be playing multiple matches during the course of a day versus where in other sports like football, basketball, or baseball or hockey, it's just one match per day. Coordination, because esport athletes have to manipulate a joystick or they have to manipulate a mouse. So they have to manipulate something, and there are several going into speed, there's several neurocognitive and neuromuscular processes that then blend with that coordination in order to produce a successful esport athlete. Or these things kind of play in and determine who makes it from the club level to the college level and to the professional level. So jumping right in, we're going to start talking about aerobic exercise. So this was my study, the impact of aerobic exercise on esport performance. I actually had the honor to present this at the American Physical Therapy Association's National Conference this year in Washington, D.C. in 2019. And there's a picture of me and my poster. And essentially what we were looking at was over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of research on aerobic exercise and its impact on motor learning. Motor learning being defined as, your ability to sequentially complete motor actions in order to complete a skill and sequence them in order to complete a skill. So there's differences between moderate intensity and intense aerobic exercise, and I'll kind of get into those in the next few slides. But what essentially they found was that moderate intensity aerobic exercise seems to facilitate acquiring a motor task, or facilitating the performance of a motor task immediately after you complete the aerobic exercise, where intense aerobic exercise actually seems to facilitate the retention or consolidation of a motor task. So let's follow this chart down. So if you look at the moderate intensity aerobic exercise, it seems that it has a psychological effect, almost like a mental warm-up, or it increases your awareness and it primes your cognitive system. And it also excites the it excites your motor cortex so that when you're actually playing the game, your responses might be a little bit quicker here or there. There's not been a lot of research on that, but that's what the theory is. If you look at intense aerobic exercise, where that seems to play a role is when you're doing intense aerobic exercise, your body's more likely to start producing blood lactate. It's more likely to start producing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's more likely to start producing vascular endothelial-like growth factor. And all these things play into neurogenesis and angiogenesis, which is basically neurogenesis is your brain's ability to start sprouting some new nerves, and angiogenesis is your brain's ability to start sprouting new microvasculature, which is going to provide your brain with more blood, ergo more fuel. So that's basically the mechanisms behind whether moderate aerobic exercise or intense aerobic exercise works, but both seem to work.
And we say both seem to work to do what?
To improve, at least in my study. So granted, mine was only a case study. We didn't have multiple subjects, so we can't make any definitive conclusions. But as far as my case study and as far as other research that has been more than just a case study, it does seem that aerobic exercise in general facilitates acquiring a motor task. Whether that task be esport performance, whether that task be learning to play a guitar, whether that task be, learning to sew, or just any motor task in general.
So basically, if anyone's looking to improve some kind of motor ability within themselves, aerobic exercise associated with that helps. That's the basic.
Yeah. Go on a brisk walk, go on an exercise bike, just get a little bit of sweat going. Yeah.
And just to make sure I'm not making assumptions, and with motor skills, that's like gross motor skills, fine motor skills. Are you breaking it down that specific, or are you just making any kind of like movement coordination type stuff?
Any kind of movement coordination type stuff. Okay. So the literature hasn't been, and as far as I've seen too, there hasn't been any real specific literature on fine motor coordination versus just a motor skill in general. Mm-hmm. It just seems that if there's any kind of process where your brain has to process a sensory stimuli, then affect that stimuli and affect a response via your muscles or any kind of coordinated muscular response, it seems that aerobic exercise facilitates that.
Nice.
All right, so going back into it. So what we then did was I took a subject who's familiar with playing video games, because I didn't want video games to be a novel task for the subject, but the subject had never played our game in question, and the game we looked at was Rocket League. The reason we looked at Rocket League was because you can create a custom training scenario in Rocket League. So I created a training scenario that was 100 different shots. Every shot was different, but every shot was the same between training scenarios. So shot 1 was the same on week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But shot one was different from shots 2 through 100. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yes. So basically, like there's 100 different shots, but they're
Right.
consistent from week to week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfect. So then what we did, if you look at the top left corner where it's attempts made on the bottom, you have baseline, rest one retention, mod one retention. So what we did was we took the subject over 6 weeks and we exposed them to the 100 shot training scenario. So baseline was week one. Rest one was his initial performance of the 100 shots again the following week, and rest one retention was just a test to look at whether he was able to retain his performance, and that was completed 24 to 48 hours after the prior training scenario. So basically, the way it worked out was I saw my subject on a Sunday, and then I would see him again the following Wednesday and Friday over the course of 6 weeks. So what we did
So
was
in this
we
case, like that baseline would be Sunday, rest one would be Wednesday, rest one retention would have been
So
the
so
Friday.
opposite. So that
Oh,
baseline is the only time that it wasn't baseline was I
gotcha.
wanted to see what his baseline score was,
Sure.
and then a week later we started with rest one, which was the first scenario of the experiment.
Gotcha.
So then what we did was we introduced aerobic exercise sequentially. So week one he just rested. Week two he was on an exercise bike for 25 minutes at a moderate intense pace. In the next slide we'll go over what moderate intensity and intense aerobic exercise pacing is or dosing is. But week two he did moderate aerobic exercise. Week three he did
And, and
intense.
and this is right before playing, so he would do this
Yeah.
exercise and then go
Yes.
play.
Yeah, so if you see in that picture right there, he's set up on a computer with the PS4 playing Rocket League.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see the exercise bike there. The exercise bike is off to the right, but he would do just 25, 30 minutes on the bike, whether it was moderate, or 15 minutes, whether it was intense, and then he'd come right around and jump onto the game.
Hmm.
No rest. He would just walk and immediately start playing. So what we found was that I initially expected a learning curve. He'd never played the game, but because he was repeatedly exposed to the same scenario, I expect his performance to increase no matter what, whether he was
Right.
doing exercise or not.
Right.
And that's what we kind of saw as a trend. Whoops. Wait, there we go. That's what we kind of saw as a trend. The aerobic exercise did facilitate his performance. So he went from 33 during the first condition. Then the next week right after aerobic exercise, he went up to 41. And then the following week with intense aerobic exercise, he went up to 53. Where the study actually showed its merit so that was the end of week three. So then the following week he rested. He didn't do any aerobic exercise. He just played through the game. And immediately his performance went from 53 shots made to 41 shots made.
Huh.
Which, yeah, go ahead.
No. I just was acknowledging. One of my first questions was going to be, well, if he keeps getting, he's naturally going to get better over time. So how does it
Right.
factor that in? But you've already answered the question, and I said, huh, because I'm looking at the results, and I'm actually looking at the labels and the x-axis down there, and realize, huh,
Yeah.
yeah, the rest. I mean, you're about to say it, so I won't say, but it makes a difference. Go ahead.
Yeah, so from intense he went from 53. The next time we introduced rest, he went down to 41, which then if you look down at the chart on the bottom right of the screen, that was a net 23% decrease in his performance. So his performance went down by nearly a quarter of what it was before. And then we reintroduced aerobic exercise in in weeks 5 and 6. And then initially he brought his performance back up to 59 shots, which was 6 better than what it had been initially. So then after a 23% increase by removing aerobic exercise from the equation, he went back up by a net, let's say 13%, 16%. So that was basically the crux of the study and where we saw the most merit in performing aerobic exercise. The fact that, he had acquired all this skill, and then once we removed aerobic exercise, his performance immediately decreased.
That that that's significant. This is great.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it was really hard to quantify everything, and that's why we had to do it with Rocket League, just because it was a consistent.
Mm-hmm.
You wanted to create consistency and validity within the study by having him repeatedly exposed to the same thing. But I'm interested to see how this plays out in other games. Again, the difficulty is going to be creating an experiment with adequate scientific control to then
Right.
see if these are the same results.
Right.
But
That would be hard.
the initial results are promising. So then deconstructing that, what is aerobic exercise? So I keep saying moderate, intense. Intense can also be called vigorous aerobic exercise, but what is aerobic exercise? So let's start at the bottom there where it says APMHR. That's your age predicted maximal heart rate. For anyone who wants to calculate their age predicted maximal heart rate, you take the number 220 and then subtract that by your age. There are more complex ways of deriving a better age predicted maximal heart rate, but for the general public, this is pretty much adequate and serves everyone. The difference here being is if anyone is taking a beta blocker, if anyone's on medication for hypertension or something like that, then that equation is not going to work for you. We'll have to use another equation. But for the general public, that equation should suffice. And
So,
then,
so if someone's
yeah,
20 years old, their APMHR would be 200,
200.
and 50% of that would be 100, just to make that, in case that's not super obvious for everyone. So that's how you
Exactly.
take that percentage of whatever that number is. Great. Okay.
Exactly. So whatever that number is. So then say you want to do moderate intense aerobic
Ooh,
exercises,
real quick,
which, yeah.
how best for people to know what their heart rate is? What's the best way to do that? I see you got a picture there, but how do
So
you
picture
recommend?
there, easy way, you radial pulse. You just kind of bring your hand up, come to the side of your thumb basically, and then right at the base of your wrist, just feel there for your pulse.
Yeah.
You can count that for 30. So the way your pulse is traditionally recorded is beats per minute. So an easy way to do it so that you're not having to rest for a minute while you're doing exercise is just take it for 30 seconds and then multiply that times two. So if
Perfect.
I do this for 30 seconds and my pulse is 45, I multiply that by two and know my current pulse is 90 beats per minute.
Perfect.
But nowadays everyone has access to a Fitbit, or the majority of people have access to a Fitbit or some kind of activity tracker, and that usually will suffice your activity or the accuracy of tracking your activity.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So then going back to that, finding out what your age predicted maximal heart rate, then if you want to figure out what range of heart rate you should be exercising in to know whether you're in a moderate threshold or an intense threshold, moderate is traditionally defined as 55 to 70% of your age predicted maximal heart rate. Intense or vigorous exercise is usually defined as 70 to 85% of your age predicted maximal heart rate. So say you want to try this out for yourself and you want to do some moderate aerobic exercise because you want to see if it improves your performance immediately when you're playing Overwatch, when you're playing Call of Duty, NBA 2K, whatever your game is. Basically, you would figure out what 220 minus your age is, and then go ahead and multiply that by, let's pick a round number in the middle between 55 and 70, we'll say 65%. So take whatever your number is, multiply that by 0.65, and your heart rate should be what that equation gives you.
And examples of if people were just trying to get started, like moderate exercise, I'm assuming that's like a brisk walk, and intense would be like jogging. Is that? I mean, obviously
Exactly.
it's going to vary
That's
person
kind
to
of,
person, but
yeah,
generally speaking,
definitely. That's a good way of kind of figuring it out and trying to track it for yourself. But the other difference here, which I didn't include on the slide, is with moderate intensity aerobic exercise, with both of these, you're tapping into different energy systems. So with moderate intensity aerobic exercise, you're tapping more into your fat stores. So consequently, if you're trying to lose weight, you would want to do something like moderate intensity aerobic exercise because you're able to exercise for a longer period of time, but you're still putting a taxing condition on your cardiovascular system and on your body as a whole. So moderate intensity aerobic exercise also traditionally lasts between 25 to 30 minutes. You can go longer than that, but the goal there in keeping the intensity low is that you can keep the time that you're exercising high. With intense or vigorous aerobic exercise, you're looking at a much higher intensity exercise, but that typically only lasts between 10 to 15 minutes. So you're exercising at a much higher intensity, but you're only doing it for a shorter period of time. And there you're tapping more into your carbohydrate stores and just other available energy, where your moderate intense aerobic exercise, like I said before, you're tapping more into fat stores.
and your case study, your research, if I understood it
Yes.
correctly, said that the gameplay actually improved the more intense the exercise was. So moderate helped, but intense aerobic exercise helped even more, based upon that case study. Is that right?
Um,
Or is that
so,
reading into
so
it too much?
So I tried to tease that out, and I didn't include in here, but my write-up for the study is available on nerdsandwellness.com. You guys can find it. So I tried to use other methods to try and really tease out whether intense aerobic exercise or moderate aerobic exercise had more of an impact. According to my findings, I couldn't really make that conclusion. The only conclusion I could make was that aerobic exercise facilitated motor performance.
Gotcha.
Um, where, so going back to the initial slide or the slide prior, if intense aerobic exercise seemed to facilitate performance more, we wouldn't have seen. So if you look down here where intense one and intense one retention, so his performance actually decreased where intense aerobic exercise should have caused him to increase his performance. Same thing.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Then where intense two and intense two retention, his performance went up there. So both times
Oh, okay.
when doing intense aerobic exercise, his performance should have either maybe improved a little bit or at least stayed the same. Um, but on the whole, I mean, you can see how the trajectory of the slope kind of goes in a little bit of an angle, but on the whole, the trajectory goes up. So the only real conclusion I can make was that aerobic exercise facilitated motor performance.
And remind me, what was the difference between intense one and then intense one retention?
So intense one retention, there was no exercise prior. It was just the condition where he would play through the game just to see whether he had retained
Gotcha.
performance. Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
on all those retention, on all the ones that say retention, he just played through the game. He didn't actually exercise prior to them.
And so really, intense one retention was the same as rest two. Really.
Exactly. Yeah,
Gotcha.
exactly. And you can
Gotcha.
see how by removing the exercise, it just kept going down and down and down and down.
So really, intense one retention, rest two retention were all rest days,
We're
basically.
all rest days. Yep, exactly.
Gotcha.
Yep,
So the performance never actually decreased after aerobic exercise, but it always decreased after
after
rest.
retention. Yep,
That's helpful. Okay.
yep,
Thank you.
of course. All right, so we'll move on. So,
Oh, and real quick, let me. What I was
yep,
going to ask, um, and if this is getting ahead, just interrupt me or tell me to
no
stop,
worries.
or we can answer later on. So my mind's immediately going to if someone's getting ready to play, especially competitively, whether it be professionally or just at home, whatever that may be. Um, what do they do? What's the best thing for them to do aerobically right beforehand? Are you getting to that, or should we talk about that now? Or
No, let's talk about that now.
yeah,
So that's part of the whole topic where it's uncharted waters. Esports performance enhancement is in its infancy stages, and we're really the pioneers that are trying to figure out where this is going to go. So yeah, the goal is to eventually design programs for athletes specific to their game and specific to their role in games. In general, I would recommend, maybe jumping on an exercise bike or trying to go on a brisk walk, maybe 15 to 20 minutes right before you go on your game, just because it's going to produce those effects that we saw prior of moderate aerobic exercise. So it's going to be like a mental warm up. It's going to increase the excitability of your nervous system. It's going to get blood flowing, and it's going to just serve as, a general warm up for any athlete before they go out on the field and perform in competition.
awesome, very good.
Yep. Um, So then I guess moving on to breathing. Breathing is a topic that's, of course, really similar to aerobic exercise because anyone that knows anything about exercise, when you go out and try and go on a brisk walk or run, your breath is going to start to get heavy and you're going to start breathing more. So Brian, let me ask you a question. Do you see the soda can there on the
I
bottom?
do.
What keeps pressure? So I just gave the answer away. Um,
Yes.
so when the soda can is full and closed, what prevents you from being able to crush it?
Well, I mean the pressure on inside from yeah.
The pressure in it. So we're gonna jump and use this soda can analogy with the picture up top, which is of your core and in your whole trunk.
Right.
So in the front, you have your core muscles. You have, your rectus abdominis, your obliques, your transverse abdominis, all the muscles that make multiple layers in front in your core. In the back, you have your low back muscles, your multifidi, which are the most important muscles, I would probably say. But then you have your erector spinae group, you have your rotors, you have a bunch of different muscle groups in your back too, your lats, your thoracolumbar fascia. On the bottom, you have your pelvic floor, which is the muscles that control you or allow you to void and not void and use the bathroom. And then on the top, you have your diaphragm, which kind of like the soda can is the control or the pressure valve between increasing the pressure in your stomach or decreasing the pressure in your stomach. Weightlifters, when they're going to lift Olympic weightlifters, when they're going to lift an incredibly heavy weight, what do they tend to do? They tend to take in a deep breath, bear down, and lift.
Okay.
Why? Because it creates a lot of pressure in their trunk and their core, and it allows or it aids their spine to have a little bit more stability.
Hmm.
Talking about spinal stability is a hot topic, and some people will tell you that our spine is an inherently unstable structure. Other people will tell you it's an inherently stable structure. I'm kind of in the middle, and we'll kind of forget the semantics for the purpose of this. So I'm going to use the word spinal stability, but increasing pressure via your diaphragm is going to improve core stability. It's going to improve spinal stability. Esport athletes are highly susceptible to back injury or core injuries because they rely so heavily on their core and back. So when an esport athlete is traditionally sitting in a chair while they're playing competition, your legs are taken away from you. So the only muscles you have that are kind of keeping you upright and keeping you in an erect posture is your core, your pelvic floor, your low back, and then your diaphragm. So breathing has an incredibly powerful role in aiding just stability of your whole trunk and your core. And then where breathing is also important, I think, for esport athletes is ventilation. So what I mean by ventilation is basically just breaths per minute. So bringing in oxygen, blowing out CO2. It's just oxygen exchange. Does that make sense, those two?
It does. I just want to make sure I'm connecting into esports well
Yep.
because like the stability piece, yeah, having that help. I understand how that helps with your stability, ventilation. I mean, generally speaking, it's like yeah, that makes sense. When it comes to esports performance
Right.
and competitively, or again any kind of gaming, um, if I want to, I mean, you can kind of fill in some gaps, but so obviously the stability piece is just helpful because just I guess good posture and general stability, it helps it improves my breathing, and then that even even flow of breathing just helps my body work better and function better, which helps my mind stay sharper and
Yeah.
everything else. Is that the general idea?
Yeah, it goes both ways, and we're going to get into ventilation a little bit more. So let's jump back into stability real quick.
Okay.
I think the big take home points that I want to provide here is that spinal stability is important for esport athletes because it's going to help prevent injury. So any tissue for just any person in the general population, any tissue that is susceptible to increased load is susceptible to injury. And I don't want to paint a pessimistic view of our bodies because our bodies are innately able to adapt and they're robust in their ability to prevent injury. But any tissue that accepts a little bit more load than it's equipped for is susceptible to injury. That being said, esport athletes have to rely on a lot of core stability and a low back endurance and stability. So if they're not training their bodies to accept this load, they're going to be susceptible to injury. So breathing can help increase spinal stability, but spinal stability is also going to help increase your breathing. So it's almost like a reciprocal relationship. But essentially, the stability is important because it's going to help esport athletes prevent injury.
And okay, so I'm taking a few notes, catching up there. The So what should esports athletes do in a lot of this? Is that what you're getting to?
Yeah, so we're going to
Okay.
get into particularly diaphragm exercises and what they can do to strengthen their diaphragm. Um, but as far as other methods for core stability, just a lot of like core training. So exercises that are going to strengthen your core, whether that be a bird dog, a plank, some controlled sit-ups where you're not getting a lot of too much bend in your spine. And then just some low back specific exercises. So things where you're focusing on your multifidi, your lats. If anyone has any questions, they could reach out specifically to me, or specifically to a physical therapist or personal trainer for specific exercises. But I mean, we could get into that for hours talking
Right.
about
Yeah.
exercises to target those muscles. But
Yeah.
anything that's really going to target your multifidi and anything that's really going to target your core,
Great. Thank you.
as far as muscle strength and stability. And then in a few slides, we're going to get into what you could do for your diaphragm.
Perfect.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about ventilation. So ventilation is important. It's a normal process that happens at all times. So you're breathing in oxygen, you're blowing out CO2. Where this can start to become an issue or becomes particularly important for esport athletes is hyperventilation or hypocapnia. So when any organism is stressed, what's the normal response? Our autonomic nervous system kicks in. We start engaging in like a fight or flight response, and we start to breathe rapidly. But what happens there is we start to breathe in a lot of oxygen, and we're not blowing out enough CO2. So relatively, our blood starts to have more oxygen in it and less carbon dioxide. So the condition where you have more oxygen in your system is called hyperventilation because you're ventilating too much.
Hmm.
And then what that results in is hypocapnia, which means there's relative less CO2 than should be required in your blood. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I guess hypocapnia is like a second stage of hyperventilation, maybe.
They kind of yes and no. They kind of happen concomitantly, so they happen at the same time almost.
Okay. So they're kind of like different descriptions of a similar condition, maybe.
Yeah, it's describing the flip side of a coin. So if you're
Gotcha.
hyperventilating, you're becoming hypocapnic.
Gotcha. So hyperventilation is like your oxygen proportionally is too high.
Right.
Hypocapnia is your CO2 is too low, which again, it's describing
Exactly.
the same situation but from different sides. Gotcha.
Exactly. Perfect.
Okay.
So, and then again, going back to it, so whenever an organism is stressed, they're going to start hyperventilating. Any organism, whether it's, the gazelle that's going to get eaten by the cheetah, or whether it's an esport athlete that's going to engage in a competition for the first time. So whenever an organism is stressed, a normal response is hyperventilation because of an autonomic system overdrive or a kick in of your autonomic nervous system. So where this can start to become pathological for an esport athlete is that hyperventilation or hypocapnia leads to muscle guarding or co-contraction. So now when you're upright and playing a game, if you're breathing too much or if your heart rate's pulsing too much, you can potentially start to experience episodes of muscle guarding or co-contraction. And what that's going to do is it's going to increase, again, what we talked about before, the load on tissue that's not ready to accept this new load. What it also can lead to is neuronal excitation. So now your nerves are in a state where they are more likely to fire. They're more apt to fire. So particularly for esports, in a game where fine motor precision and coordination and timing is so important, muscle twitching is not something that's a good thing. And then kind of playing along with that too, esport athletes who have to really use their eyes on a constant basis because they're seeing something and reacting to something, it can lead to dizziness and visual disturbances. And then furthermore, it could lead to anxiety, which can all really decrease your performance. So mitigating hyperventilation or mitigating that stress response is essential and paramount to esport athletes regarding performance enhancement.
As far as hyperventilation, I think it could be helpful
Yep.
for us to get a little more understanding of what you mean there because,
Yes.
I think a popular conception of hyperventilation is someone like panic breathing and like needing a brown paper sack, for example. And it sounds like that's maybe not quite the extreme you're describing. Maybe there's some other more moderate examples of that affect us that maybe we don't realize.
Right. So I mean, when you go out on a jog, you're essentially hyperventilating because you're bringing in more oxygen than CO2, and that's what starts to produce the lactic acid in your system, and it starts to produce that muscle burn. Is the fact that your blood is becoming almost even a little bit more acidic because it has so much, it's retaining so much oxygen. So anytime your ventilation rate starts to increase, anytime your heart rate starts to increase, it's a continuum. Yes, at the end of that continuum is the person breathing into the brown paper bag. But at some point in that continuum, when your heart is pumping harder, when your breathing starts to increase, you're essentially hyperventilating. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, I'm taking some notes. So that basically and so that's significant to esports athletes or any kind of gamers because, again, once your heart rate's rising, that means it's basically saying, hey, your body's becoming more susceptible to hyperventilation, which means is being more susceptible to,
A
again,
decrement in performance.
yeah, right. I mean, it affects your performance in lots of ways in terms of your nerves firing, muscle twitching, dizziness, anxiety,
Right.
and even like your core strength, like putting pressure in places that aren't ready for it. Okay, that's helpful.
Yep. Cool. So what we've been doing a lot of research at least at the University of Miami, we have a lot of different physical therapists who are using this, and we're using this in our treatment for orthopedic patients too, is what's called inspiratory muscle training. So the bottom picture there where it says Pro, that's called a Pro 2 device. And what that does is it measures the strength essentially of your diaphragm. So what you do is you basically put that the mouthpiece into your mouth, and then you take in a deep maximal inspiration. So a lot of people, whenever we give them the device, we explain it to them, and then the first thing they do is blow out. Well, blowing out doesn't really require diaphragm activation. It requires your diaphragm to relax. When your diaphragm activates is when you take in a deep breath. So what they're supposed to do is they put the mouthpiece in their mouth, and then they take in a deep breath, a very forceful breath over their max effort. So they're taking in a forceful breath for the max amount of time they can. And then via that Pro 2 device, we can calculate age predicted normal values for whether they're, in their normal value or whether they're deficient in their diaphragm strength. It's a really
So
cool.
these are assessment tools.
These are, yeah. So the bottom one is an assessment tool. And it's, a lot of the research that's coming out with it is pretty remarkable. They've been using it with patients who have chronic low back pain and really nothing's worked for them. And, nothing's helped get them out of pain. And, maybe this doesn't get them out of pain. Maybe it doesn't give them 100% pain relief, but they're starting to see improved function, whether it's because, the diaphragm is giving them a little bit more spinal stability, but also secondarily because you're training your ventilatory system to be more efficient, your tissue is getting more oxygenated. So you're getting more fresh blood to your muscles and your ligaments and your tendons and different things. So like I said, maybe they're not getting 100% out of pain, but they're being more functional. And being more functional is going to translate to better mood and better affect. And we know a big percentage or a big portion of, the debilitating effects of low back pain are biopsychosocial in nature, and they're not just strictly, biomechanical in nature, that it's particular to your low back. So I've started to kind of play around with this and looking at the Pro 2 device with some esport athletes, and by and by, for the most part, everyone that I've done this assessment with is on the low end of normal. So they're not, necessarily pathologically deficient in their diaphragm strength, but everyone, for the most part, in the general public is a little deficient in where their normal value should be. So that's interesting because it then means we're not really focusing a lot on what we should be doing on deep breathing exercises. So the device on the top is called the Power Breathe. You can buy that on Amazon. You can also do inspiratory muscle training exercises without those devices. You could just get a coffee straw. So you could just go to Starbucks and pick up a coffee straw and you can do these exercises with. But essentially what you want to do is start to train your system to adapt to being able to take in a long, forceful, deep breath, basically. So what these devices do is, so that blue one, I don't know if you can see on the bottom there in that like little plastic casing that you can see through that white device.
Mm-hmm.
So that little white piece, essentially you can kind of screw that on and it puts resistance in the mouthpiece. So then when you're taking a deep breath, you have no resistance. You can take in a deep breath without an issue. If you crank up the resistance on that, it's kind of like if you went from just doing a bicep curl with no weight to then doing a bicep curl with a 20-pound weight,
That's
because now
fascinating.
that's
So
giving
it's
you
like
resistance.
it's like breathing weightlifting.
Yep, it's resistance training for your
Resistance
diaphragm.
training. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Um,
And
so
what's that one called? That blue one?
so the blue one is called the Power Breathe.
Power
And you
Breathe.
could you could find that on Amazon. They have a bunch of different ones. They have some that sync with your phone via Bluetooth. That have different training regimens. I'm still kind of toying around with how I'm using it specifically with esports athletes, but I have, like I said, used the Pro 2 before with esport athletes, and it's pretty remarkable how they are they are not, they're just not where they should be, which is consistent with the general public. I will say, however, though, that I've used the Pro 2 with a pro esports team and with a college esports team that I've talked to. And what was interesting was the players that were more on par with where they should have been for their age predicted normal values were the better players on the teams.
Hmm. And just to be clear, remember the Pro 2 is more of an assessment tool,
Yep.
whereas the Power Breathe on the top is an actual strengthening tool.
Yep, exactly.
Gotcha.
And I mean, you can
Okay.
use the Pro 2 as a training tool as well, but it's really expensive because it's made to be an assessment tool. The other ones are just basically treatment tools. It would basically be on the weight rack with all your dumbbells or all your medicine balls.
That's awesome.
Yep. So benefits of inspiratory muscle training, like we kind of talked about before, right there, first bullet point. So resistance training for your diaphragm. It can improve your cardiovascular endurance because now your muscles and your diaphragm specifically, which again is what gauges your ventilation, is more efficient. So your endurance is going to be better. And remember, endurance is important for esport athletes because your matches take a very long time. It can promote spinal stability via a closed pressure system. You have more efficient energy production, reduces oxygen requirements. It reduces your breathing effort. It promotes autonomic nervous system modulation, so fight or flight versus relaxation.
Hmm.
So again, going back to, competition is a stressful event, which means you're going to be stressed and therefore likely to hyperventilate a little bit, which is a normal process for our body. So this whole, I don't want to paint the picture that I'm saying, stress is a bad thing. A little bit of stress is good. A little bit of stress is gonna, it's physiological, and there's a reason why our bodies have adapted over time to respond to stress. Where you start to tap into areas where you might not want to be is when the stress is too much that it's starting to decrease your performance. So if you can start training in stressful scenarios and being able to mitigate that stress response, your performance is going to paramountly increase. And then inspiratory muscle training can normalize your blood pH again because we're talking about carbon dioxide and oxygen levels in your blood, and it can reduce musculoskeletal pain.
Nice.
So the next topic is motor imagery. Do you want to cover anything on the breathing aspect, or are we good
I
there?
think we're pretty good. I think you've done a great job on that. Thank you.
All right, sweet. My pleasure. All right, so let's talk about motor imagery. So this is the last kind of subject I've kind of I think is a nuanced approach to esports performance enhancement. And again, all of these are really nuanced approaches. We know just from a general kind of caveman, like something so easy a caveman can understand, is that exercise is going to benefit anyone, and exercise is going to benefit esport athletes. Where I think esport athletes are missing the boat is that they don't have people who are addressing them with specific things like this or specific exercise training programs to improve their performance when you have that in basketball, football, baseball, and hockey. Um, so let's talk about definitions first. Motor imagery is the practice of mentally rehearsing a physical task without actually engaging in the task. So a good example of this is a baseball hitter that's in the on deck circle. So they're not at the plate, they're in the on deck circle, and they're kind of just seeing what the pitcher is throwing, feeling, getting a feel for how the speed looks like on the field, and then maybe he takes a few practice swings. So that would actually require a little bit of physical performance, but motor imagery by and by is just really thinking about doing a motor task.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially me sitting here, closing my eyes and thinking, okay, I'm going to dribble up to the free throw line, take a shot makes, done. So that's what motor imagery is. It's used as a training tool in many other professional sports. The reason that it's actually used a lot is because when you actually just close your eyes and think about performing a task, you're sharing overlapping structures in your brain with the areas that are actually active when you're engaging in the task. So it's not necessarily from a neuro and electrophysiological perspective. It's not that you're actually doing the task, but a lot of the same areas in your brain are being active when you're doing this.
So it's like partially simulating, and so you're still
Yeah.
you're getting some benefit from doing it. Basically, it's not the same as doing it, but it's still worthwhile.
Exactly. And it's suggested to be effective in improving motor performance. So then another concept that's very closely tied to motor imagery is temporal congruence. Temporal congruence is the equivalence between how long it actually takes to complete a motor task physically versus how long it takes to imagine completing the same motor tasks. So, and there's a reason I'm using the basketball example, because the study I'm going to cite in the next slide is a basketball example. So temporal congruence is how close I am between actually dribbling from, let's say, half court to the free throw line, taking a shot, versus me thinking about going from half court to the free throw line and taking a shot.
Okay. Got it.
So this study I think is really cool. It's called Motor Experiences with a Sport-Specific Implement Affects Motor Imagery. So what they had subjects do was they had subjects take 5 different shots, all around a basketball court, around a half court perimeter. And what they found was that, so they had professional basketball players. I believe this was overseas. It wasn't done in the United States, but they essentially had professionals from their country versus amateurs in their country complete these same shots. And what they found was 2 pretty cool effects that I'm trying to implement for esports specifically. So what they found was that the professionals had way more temporal congruence than amateurs. So it seems like having skill in a particular motor task is going to make you more temporal, or is going to produce more temporal congruence.
Okay.
And then aside from that, it seems like there's facilitatory and inhibitory effects for motor imagery. So when they had the professionals hold a basketball and imagine performing the shot, they were temporally congruent. When they took away the basketball and had them just think about doing the task, they started to lose a little bit of temporal congruence.
Interesting.
And then when they went ahead and gave them a volleyball instead of the basketball, or instead of nothing, their temporal congruence went down even more.
Wow. I would not have expected that, which I guess is why
So,
you said it.
yeah, so that was really cool, that there's facilitatory effects and inhibitory effects that are created by creating conditions where there's specificity. So a big way to kind of practice motor imagery, and this is developed by Holmes and Collins in their article in 2001, and this is really an article that a lot of pro teams use for athletic training purposes for their athletes, it's called the PETLEP model. So it looks at physical, environment, task, timing, learning, emotion, and perspective. And if you can kind of integrate all these into your motor imagery techniques or your motor imagery practice, it seems that you're going to get the most benefit out of it. So physical, in the sense that you want to tune yourself to as many of the 5 senses as possible. So for an esport athlete, if you know you're going to be participating in, a certain domain or a certain arena that you're familiar with, try to think about what the lighting looks like in there, and try to think of what the sounds look like in there, and what the smell is going to be in there if you've been in there
And
before.
again,
And
this is like the idea of like basically, I'm imagining someone like sitting down with their eyes closed, mentally
exactly.
going through what this looks
Yep.
like and creating it in their mind. Okay.
Yep. And then furthermore, not just imagining the environment, but what they found was, and this is actually true from a lot of psychological studies too, was that if you can put yourself in that environment where you're doing the motor imagery, it has more facilitatory effects. So if you know you're going to be, playing, remotely versus someone in their state and you're playing in your state, where you're going to be competing in that, let's say you're competing in your training room, it's going to be beneficial to do motor imagery in your training room versus just doing it in your dorm room or doing it in your bedroom.
So let me
Um,
ask a question. So in that situation, so it's more effective to do it in the training room, but then you can also say, well, why don't you just train? Like, is there a benefit to doing
right.
the imagery stuff and instead of training, or is it always better to train? But if you can't train, this is also helpful.
I mean, I'd be lying to you if I gave you a concrete answer on that. That's
Okay.
this. We're charting the waters again in esports performance enhancement. It's really in its infancy stages, but I think one thing esport athletes have to be wary about is overtraining, and I think that's
Mm,
something that they're susceptible to.
gotcha.
Um, Esport athletes, particular versus other athletes, because in other athletic events, you're gonna experience muscle fatigue a lot quicker than an esport athlete is. An esport athlete is going to kind of deal with cognitive and mental fatigue, but because of our culture and because of just other factors, we're taught to push through cognitive and mental fatigue. And if they're not experiencing that physical fatigue, they may be more apt to think, oh, I'm just going to push through this. I'm going to push through this. I'm going to push through this. And then you can kind of start to see decreases in performance that way. So esport athletes are definitely susceptible to overtraining. So this might be something that kind of supplants your overtraining, or this
Gotcha.
might even be something that you use as a warm up. And I'll kind of get into at the end now how I'm proposing using motor imagery. But it's essentially almost like a warm up.
Gotcha.
Um, and then, kind of keeping along here. Motor imagery is important regarding the task. So let's say you're an Overwatch player and you're a tank. It's not going to help you if you start to use motor imagery and imagine yourself as a support player. You have to think about what your task is and what your specific task is to your team. Timing. So timing again plays into all the temporal congruence we've talked about. Learning. So the emulated task should be adaptable as the athlete becomes more skilled with the task. So say you kind of create this, whatever, training program looking at motor imagery, and it doesn't continue to evolve as your skill level continues to increase, it's not going to be of benefit to you. Emotion, if you know you're going to be a little nervous or a little stressed or maybe even a little bit hyperventilatory when you're playing your competition, maybe it would be wise to go ahead and exercise a little bit before the competition, or try to get yourself a little nervous thinking about this competition in front of thousands of people that you're going to be engaging in, so that you can kind of start to simulate a little bit of the emotions you're going to feel when you're engaging in competition. And then perspective. So this is a really cool aspect of, and I don't know, you might have thought of it already, but motor imagery, like, are you picturing yourself playing the game, or are you
Mm,
looking at yourself from a third person perspective
interesting.
actually playing the game? And there's some research out there that if you use a first person perspective, it seems to enhance the feel and sequencing of the task, where a third person perspective seems to enhance the execution of a specific task.
Interesting.
So if you're trying to learn a particular pattern, or if you're trying to, the analogy I always kind of use is in Rocket League, learning how to do aerials, because aerials are a big part of Rocket League. Maybe doing a first person perspective is going to be more beneficial to you. If you are trying to improve the execution of a task, so maybe sinking in a corner shot in Rocket League, or sinking a three pointer in NBA 2K, a third person perspective might benefit you a little bit more. So there's even a difference in the way you practice the motor imagery as far as your perspective. Um, and then the reason I think motor imagery is so important for esport athletes is because esports is unique in how often gamers are streaming or watching streams or watching tutorial videos on YouTube or watching other players play on Steam. So there's a lot of time to watch and learn other players play.
Oh, this is fascinating.
And there's a lot of time that you can actually maximize on your own performance by using some of these motor imagery techniques. So some of the stuff I'm proposing is, we already know that motor imagery, it seems to be facilitated by engaging your sensory system or holding something. So when you're watching someone play a tutorial video or when you're watching someone stream content, why don't you hold the PS4 if you're a PS4 player, or your Xbox controller if you're an Xbox player, or hold a
Man,
mouse in your hand if you're
never ever would have thought of that. That's
a computer
fascinating.
player? Again, it might not make a huge impact on your performance, but we know there's facilitatory effects to learning. So I think engaging as many of the five senses and as many of your sensory motor and sensory systems as possible is going to benefit your performance.
You know what makes
Um,
I'm sorry, you know what
yeah,
makes me think about is like people say like there's a big difference between typing something and writing something. You know, there's like an
yeah,
engagement mentally and physically with actually hand writing something that
definitely.
doesn't happen when you're typing. And
Yep.
I can imagine it may seem small or sound small, but I can totally see that being one of those, 1% type improvement things where maybe if you do that 1% improvement, but you keep doing it, that becomes a
Right.
substantial
Yeah.
improvement in your performance over time, or could be. That
Definitely.
is
And
fascinating.
then yeah, thanks. Um, and I keep harking back to this example because I think this is the best example to use for motor imagery and at least just motor facilitation practices. As a baseball player on the on deck circle. So this is, baseball players have used an on deck circle for years. And there's been talks over the years about removing the on deck circle or moving it to a different part of the field because of, fear that a baseball player is going to get hit with a foul tip or a wild pitch or something like that. But it's survived and it's stayed in the game for so long because it seems to have an effect. And it seems that if you're out there and you're on the field and you're hearing the fans, not from the dugout, but from the field, and you're seeing the stadium lighting and you're seeing the pitcher and seeing their mechanics from a different perspective and seeing the speed of the ball and taking some practice cuts, it seems to improve your performance than if you just jump into the batter's box cold. So essentially, that's kind of the same principle I'm using with motor imagery and esports. It's using it as like a little warm up before you engage in play, or using it as something as an adjunct to your training program to improve your performance. And I think so maximizing on, all we've really talked about today is motor learning, aside from the breathing. But aerobic exercise to improve motor learning, motor imagery to improve motor learning. So recall that the research I talked about and earlier research that I cited, it demonstrates a correlation between circulating blood lactate levels and motor acquisition. And blood lactate levels can be replaced with just exercise there and motor acquisition. So what I'm proposing is maybe combining moderate intense aerobic exercise with motor imagery. So, maybe when you're watching a streaming video or a tutorial video, jump on an exercise bike. Now you're starting to combine a little bit of this imagery or motor facilitation with aerobic exercise. So there's no research on whether the effects compound, but I seem to think that it might. And if overtraining is an issue for esport athletes, maybe actually taking some time away from you physically playing, but still engaging in things that are going to benefit your performance, is going to be a plus for these guys. So maybe you can just imagine playing while you're on a stationary bike. Or maybe, I mean, this one is even crazier, but be on watch a tutorial video, try to play through what you're playing while you're on an exercise bike. So again, all this stuff is conjecture. There's nothing that really says this works or this is going to work. This is stuff that I'm starting the ball rolling with, and I have a few submissions into the IRB at our university to actually start researching some of this stuff. But it's stuff that's out there. It's stuff that is used in other sports. So theoretically, I don't see why it wouldn't apply to esport athletes as well.
Abilio, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for your work in
Of
doing this
course.
research and also your attention to helping esports athletes and just gamers in general. And man, just thanks so much for this presentation. I mean, I think I asked most of my questions throughout, and you're
Cool.
great to answer them. But man, just some really novel, unique things that
Thanks.
you're bringing into this. I really appreciate you sharing them with the summit and all of our attendees this year.
Thank you. No, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to just get some of this information out there and let's make gamers better. Let's improve esports.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good one.